It is January 3rd, 1777. General George Washington of the Continental Army has had a lot of setbacks up to this point, from losing Manhattan and New York City to the British and the Hessians, who have recently joined the fight of the American Revolution. Now, his position is at stake. He needs to come up with a plan because morale is also low, and to be able to win some battles, or at least be victorious in a battle. So he comes up with a plan. On Christmas, he goes and he attacks Trenton on Christmas Day. So who's to expect it? And then he goes again with confidence, attacking Trenton and another place where it is possibly known to have little to no reinforcements, at Princeton. And that is where we are today. And here we have a battle that helps turn the tide of the war and boost American morale. Battle of Princeton, January 3rd, 1777. Now I have with me here Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775, 1777. I have it on loan thanks to Second Time Books again in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Now, I also have with me The Campaign of Princeton, 1776, 1777 by Alfred Hoyt Bill, which I have read and I highly recommend reading. It's a good little book. And I also have with me The Battle Maps of the American Revolution by the American Battlefield Trust, just to help guide where we are in this battle. So, on we go. Now, the trail that I'm walking here is where the men gathered, and the Clark House Farm, or the Clark Farmhouse, is right here. And they have a really nice museum and some really nice interpreters in here to help explain the battle. So, and just over the hill here is where most of the bloodiest fighting takes place. Some accounts would say that at the Clark House, men hid behind and were shot at with a lot of musketry, and bullets whizzed by, some of the accounts say, with ferocity. And then over here down a ways, you had where George Washington famously rallied the troops for the final charge after they ran, fleeing from the heavy fighting. It's about roughly 150 so yards back I don't know how many trees were here at the time, but still quite serene. Even though the place here, a lot of fighting and bloodshed happened. I walk along this trail to see just how the landscape and terrain really affected these troops, the Continentals. As you can see here, it slopes up, and from what I see is that would be a little difficult to charge up just to get to. But let's walk back to come back around. Now George Washington, he had to convince his men for this battle to be able to stay with the army 6 more weeks, not only by paying him, not only by paying his troops however much he promised to pay if they stayed on, but he was also able to convince them to continue to fight, because what was at stake now was their livelihood, the ones they love, the ones they cherish, and the life they want to have when this war is over. And he rallies them behind here after a tragedy happens of one of his brigadier generals, Hugh Mercer, who we know dies here at Princeton 9 days after the battle, but he's mortally wounded. He will survive those wounds only for 9 more days, and he will die here in the Clark House. And that is what we're going to explore in this video, is the battle and the aftermath of what happens here at Princeton. Now, as you see here, as I come up, this terrain has gradually sloped, and it takes a big leap right here. I don't know if that was part of it or not, but don't mind the construction and everything here. They are getting ready for the 250th. So they're making it more ADA accessible to those who are handicapped. And it's very exciting. So what I'm coming up to here is where the main fighting happened. At the beginning of the battle. So the Continentals charged from where I'm coming from, this little bit of a rolling hill. And as you can see, with this tree line and everything, where they came out from against the British, would just come to help fight and be brought back from Trenton. And they're going to be all along that hill where those cars are driving through. And the battle is going to rage all on this field. From what I heard, is that nothing was shot but grape shot from the artillery from this position. It's about roughly 150 to 200 yards. I mean, this battle started roughly 40 yards apart from the lines, and as they moved back, it was 100 to 150 to 200 yards. And roughly, if you could see, there's pillars that have been there since 1958 from other events that took place That's about where the British line retreated from. But over this way is where the battle took place. Now I have here Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. It says here on page 542, the first faint glow of civil twilight was since more than seen just before 7 a.m. An ochre dawn followed half an hour later. The column, which had covered 9 miles in 6 hours of polar darkness, now halted at a road fork near Fieldstone Quaker Meeting House, 2 miles from Princeton. Here, Washington divided his army, as he had before attacking Trenton the previous week. Sullivan would lead the larger force of 5,000 men to the right up Sawmill Road, falling on the village from the southern flank. Greene's smaller division of 1,500 men was to veer north, severing the post road as a blocking force against Cornwallis's inevitable counterattack from Trenton and Maidenhead. Washington believed that the British had left behind in Princeton a single brigade of 3 regiments to guard the Army stores. The force comprised 1,200 regiments. The force comprised 1,200 regulars, including 65 German recruits, newly integrated into the British ranks despite their ignorance of English, as well as perhaps 200 other miscellaneous troops. And the sun peeped above the tree line behind the American right flank. The morning was bright, serene, and extremely cold, Major James Wilkinson would recall, with a hoar frost which spangled every object before the 2 columns heaved forward on their separate paths. At least one captain passed around a bucket of rum sprinkled with gunpowder. He encouraged his men to each drink half a gill, just 2 ounces. The potion, it was said, gave courage. Now that approaching force under General Greene was bound for a bridge at Worth's Mill, an obvious choke point to interdict the post road, plodding along a rutted track in a glen cut by the meandering Stony Brook, which is not too far from here. The Americans could neither see nor hear the redcoats ahead, but Washington could. Riding with Sullivan's column, the commanding general was alerted to the apparition of redcoats a half mile or so across the countryside. Whipping out his glass, he studied the distant road cut through the thick trees, concluded that he was looking at a modest reconnaissance detachment heading back to Princeton, and set a galloper to warn Greene. He also ordered General Mercer to peel north off Sawmill Road to intercept the enemy's patrollers before they returned to the village. Now, it says here about Mercer. Mercer, a burly physician with a compact trunk and long limbs, commanded a brigade of fewer than 350 men. The son of a Scottish clergyman, medically trained in Aberdeen, he had volunteered as a surgeon for Bonnie Prince Charlie and his doomed rebels. Disaster at Culloden in 1746 made Mercer a fugitive, and he eventually found sanctuary in America, first as a frontier doctor, then in Virginia as a respected practitioner with a daughter and 4 sons. The commander-in-chief cherished him as a fellow Mason, a fine officer, and a patriot. Mercer's patients included General Washington's mother and Martha Washington's daughter, Patsy, an epileptic. Over dinner with Dr. Rush earlier in the week, Mercer had vowed to cross the mountains and live among the Indians rather than to submit to British authority. As Mercer spurred his horse to climb toward the post road, for the first time he spied an enemy horseman in the morning glare. As we view an object when the sun shines directly in our faces, a sergeant later wrote, the general told his riflemen to fire, but the rider wheeled about and vanished before they could pull the trigger. Across the icy slope, Mercer rode, veering to the right and keeping below the ridge line. 20 skidding Virginians and 100 Pennsylvania riflemen lumbered after him. In his haste, he deployed no scouts and left most of his command behind to muscle their field guns through the snow and wheat stubble. Colonel Malwood had sent his dragoons into the vacant William Clark farm, where we are at, several hundred yards below the post road. They were closely trailed by grenadiers, 2 brass 6-pounders, and 17-foot troops, who shed their field packs before forming a skirmish line. As Mercer and his lead detachment emerged from a small apple orchard near Clark's farmhouse, which is right behind me. This used to be the apple orchard. The rebels suddenly confronted their enemy, barely 50 paces away. The dragoons rose as one from behind a split-rail fence and fired with a great clap and a spurt of white smoke. The volley mostly flew high. Splintered apple twigs littered the ground behind Mercer's men, although one corporal who fell dead seemed to bend forward to receive the ball. So he bent forward like that. The Americans returned fire, targeting officers and driving the enemy back more than 40 yards. They retreated 8 rods to their packs, which were laid in a line, an American sergeant later wrote. I advanced to the fence, which the enemy had just left, fell on one knee and loaded my musket with ball and buckshot. Our fire was most destructive. Their ranks grew thin. The captain added, the enemy screamed as if many devils had got hold of them. Lieutenant William John Hale later told his father that the rebels gave us a very heavy discharge, which brought down 7 of my platoon at once. The rest of the recruits gave way. I rallied them with some difficulty. Some dragoons also ran, so enraging the foot troops that only an officer's forceful command prevented them from firing at their fleeing comrades. The American line crumpled, then disintegrated. We drove them back through the railings, barns, and orchards, Lieutenant Hale wrote. Captain John Fleming and Lieutenant Bartholomew Yates, both of the 1st Virginia, were clubbed and stabbed repeatedly despite pleas for quarter. Captain Daniel Neal, a New Jersey artilleryman, died at his gun. A bullet struck Mercer's gray horse in the foreleg, spilling him to the ground. The general flailed away with his sword until a regular brained him with the musket butt. Others plunged their bayonets into his chest, convinced because of his handsome uniform and fine surtout that they were killing Washington. I saw him lying on the ground and saw him attempt to rise, but fall backward, a militiaman later wrote. And that is where we find out the brutal and horrible wounding and slaying of General Mercer. When he dies, he will be the 2nd highest commander in Washington's corps, or in his army. And Washington will now have a bit of a power gap among his ranks after Mercer dies. Heck, even after he's wounded. In Kingston, 4 miles from Princeton, and this is on page 548. In Kingston, 4 miles from Princeton, Washington halted briefly to confer on horseback with his lieutenants. New Brunswick lay a dozen miles ahead with supply magazines to plunder and a weak enemy garrison to rout, but his men were near at the end of their tether, exhausted, cold, and hungry. Some still lacked shoes. Officers found it difficult to keep them in ranks and to herd stragglers. The exclamation was general, Wilkinson later wrote. Oh, that we had 500 fresh men to beat up their quarters at Brunswick. But Washington knew the difference between a calculated risk and a fool's gamble. The harassed state of our own troops, many of them having had no rest for 2 nights and a day, the danger of losing the advantage we had gained by aiming at too much, induced me, by the advice of my officers, to relinquish the attempt. he subsequently wrote Hancock. So after Washington rallies his men and they attack, he decides not to follow because he doesn't want to spoil the rest of the victory and run into some kind of not trap, but in a sense where he's not going to be able to fend his own. So he rallies his men and has them fight along here and win the battle and rout the British away. It's some pretty smart thinking on my end. He wanted to make sure that he was able to win the day. But I can also only imagine what it would be like as one of the soldiers under Mercer to see him go down. You know, their general, to see him go down and lose all sense of unity. There's no structure after he goes down until Washington comes and gets them going again. For a leader, that takes a lot of strength to be able to rally the men like that and to win back the battle. And that's exactly what he does. Now, I don't know if you could see here or not, but the terrain here does slope down and then slopes back up. And the British over here, where those pillars are, that's the ground that they have taken advantage of. That is where they stand. And holding that ground in any kind of battle, the high ground would help mean some sort of advantage. But on the other side here, this is also high ground as well. And down where you see that tree, the Mercer oak, that's where it's the lowest. So you have guys behind you helping cover you because there's artillery all along this ridge, all along the top of the hill, the crest of it, shooting grape shot and shooting cannonballs and artillery against the redcoats, and you have it on the opposite side being shot at you as well. And that all that kind of chaos, that is that's one to be quite unnerving, to say the least. I can only imagine what went through every soldier's heads and their minds as they made that final push, that final charge against the British. Vice versa too. We had Hessians here. We also had the British. You know, you just hope that it wouldn't be you, I would say. There's accounts where people, the musketry was so thick. One of the officers, shot went through his hat. Another grazed his elbow, and the other one took out the sole of his shoe in a matter of so little time. And then someone nearby went to go fire his flintlock, but it was blown off from the gun. The flint was. So he went to go raise it and fire it, but it wasn't fired because it was broken. Now, what I say, that's luck. But you have to go and probably scavenge for another piece, for another weapon, because it was almost useless, except for maybe the bayonet. But where you were at, it probably wasn't close enough. That must have been terrifying as well. Now, the other book I have with me here is the Battle Maps of the American Revolution. by the American Battlefield Trust. And this is the summary it has for the Battle of Princeton. As the first rays of sun streaked across the cold morning sky of January 3rd, 1777, Cornwallis rose and gazed across Assunpink Creek at the enemy lines. To his amazement, the rebels were gone. While Cornwallis slept, Washington had put his own plan into action, leaving only 400 of his men to maintain a semblance of nocturnal activity in his camp. He had withdrawn his baggage wagons and artillery with their wheels wrapped in rags to muffle the sound, south to Burlington. At 1 a.m., the bulk of his army had departed on an audacious march around Cornwallis's force to strike at the detachment the Briton had left behind at Princeton, New Jersey. To cut Princeton off from reinforcements, Washington detached 350 troops under General Hugh Mercer to destroy the Stony Brook Bridge. Cornwallis had left 1,400 troops at Princeton under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smallwood and 1,200 at Maidenhead, now Lawrenceville, under General Alexander Leslie. In total, he had some 6,000 redcoats in the vicinity deal with the amateur army of the Americans. After leaving one regiment to garrison Princeton, Smallwood had set out with 800 soldiers to join Cornwallis at Trenton. Smallwood encountered Mercer's men on the march and ordered his men to seize the high ground on the Thomas Clark farm. Mercer, too, realized the hill's importance and led his men there. The race turned into a confused melee as the two forces confronted one another at Clark's orchard. And after several volleys, the British officers fixed bayonets and advanced. Few of Mercer's men carried bayonets. In consequence, they fell back before the intimidating British rush. "No," Mercer ordered. "Forward! Forward!" A bayonet pierced his chest, then another, and another. And a dozen blows or more, the general slumped down near the hill that would later bear his name. The American reinforcements arrived on the field, but the more experienced British pushed them back, too. A rout of the Americans seemed to be in the offing, but then Washington appeared on the scene. The Virginian advanced to within 30 yards of the British line. A round was fired, and suddenly the redcoats loosed a full volley of musket balls. When the smoke cleared, however, still atop his fine horse was the tall, lean figure of General Washington. "Charge," he ordered. "Charge! Charge them! Pull up! Pull up!" The patriots regrouped, and soon it was the redcoats who fell back. Washington pressed forward, crying out, "It's a fine fox hunt, boys!" American forces pushed the redcoats back towards Princeton, where they took cover in and around Nassau Hall, part of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. Artillerist Captain Alexander Hamilton bombarded the building, forcing the occupants to surrender. Although Smallwood broke away from the Americans with part of his force, and Cornwallis pursued, the victories of Trenton, Second Trenton, and Princeton set the American cause on a better footing for the winter of 1777. Washington settled his troops in Morristown for a harsh winter. Although 1777 started off well for Washington, it closed in a far different fashion. Because what would happen is that we would have the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777, and then Fort Mercer, named after General Mercer that was here at the battle, would hold up against the Hessian attack by von Donop, who was humiliated before the Battle of Trenton and Battle of Princeton. He would be killed there on an attack that probably should have never happened. But it is on this battlefield where the American cause that was nothing but embers and fading would be reignited by a huge ball of flame of gasoline that would, metaphorically speaking, relight the American cause and fill the hearts of every patriot to continue on to fight this war and this war would still be fought for another 6 years. 4 more years of actual fighting, well, give or take, but still. A Patriot cause was alive and well after this battle, even though it was on a 9 count and reached the count of 9 like you would in a wrestling or boxing match. But the Continentals popped up, ready to fight again, to fight another year. And that's where it was. That's where it is. Now, from along where this orchard was, we had Cadwallader advance, but we had them get brought back and then pushed, and then Washington would regroup the men after Hugh Mercer and his 350 troops would fight here, and they would face dragoons, the Highlanders, Grenadiers, the 17th Foot, light infantry, and other mounted dragoons all across this field against Malwood. And Malwood would have them charged, and they would be pulled back here. Now we had from this direction here, we had St. Clair, Stephen Scott, both combined with like 1,600 troops. We had Hand and Hitchcock come with roughly 600 troops, all the way down the Sawmill Road and come back up here, while Greene also fought along here with Mifflin. And this whole area here had some cannon and artillery up here. But where we see back here, Washington would rally the troops, and that would be the whole battlefield. You know, it's one thing looking at the battlefield here, but looking at it, looking at it on paper, you see what it is now. Now, I have with me here the Campaign of Princeton, 1776 to 1777, by Alfred Hoyt Bill, a book that I have read. And on page 105, I like to discuss the killing of Mercer in the book. Less reprehensible was the killing of Mercer, for he went down fighting. About 50 yards from William Clark's barn, which stood near the southwest corner of the orchard, Mercer on foot. A bullet had broken a foreleg in his splendid gray charger. Strove, sword in hand, to rally his men. Only a few of them had bayonets, and to all of them it appeared that the day was lost. For the rest of the army, which they had expected to find coming up from the road to the southward to support them, was nowhere to be seen. Only Sullivan's troops were visible, and they were too far away to be of any assistance. Another moment, and Mercer was surrounded by enemy soldiers. A surtout, which concealed his insignia of rank, caused them to think that they had Washington at their mercy. "Call for quarters, you damn rebel," one of them shouted. But Mercer's Scottish blood boiled at the insult. He struck out with his sword till a gun butt brought him to his knees, and bleeding from 7 bayonet wounds, he feigned death in order to escape further injuries. General Mercer, as I said, would die 9 days after his woundings at the Clark House farm, or the Clark farmhouse. And over behind me is the tree. Well, actually, no, this is the Mercer tree Jr., or the second to the tree that he was sat against and rested while the battle took place, and dying from his wounds. And being a surgeon or a medical person, he knew that he was going to die. He just didn't know when. Said that he was in good spirits. I read in Rick Atkinson's book, and that on his day of death, that's when he suffered the most. He had letters written. He had orders made. He kind of had all his stuff laid out for him because he knew he was going to die, and he feared that he knew that the bayonet wound to his armpit would be the fatal one, I suppose. And that comes with the medical knowledge he had. So Mercer would die, sadly, and I believe, if I remember correctly, he had a house down in Fredericksburg, not too far from Washington's boyhood home, along the Rappahannock River. And I believe it still stands today. It might have been seen in the Civil War, some battle or whatever, but I walked from where I was up from the hill behind me. Let me see where I can find the tree. This tree? Yeah. That tree behind me, that double, just the group of trees right there. From here, it doesn't seem so far, but walking it felt like it took a lot longer than it should have. So I can only imagine just charging it and running to the enemy, coming this way, and facing the British, who are just along where that hill is right here. And if you can see probably just a bit of those pillars are now famously part of Princeton battlefield. They have their own history of why they're here. If you ever want to look it up, I highly suggest it. But yeah, I want to have to get just a panoramic thing here. I'm gonna do that now. And this here is the terrain I had to walk. As you can see, it slopes up right up there, and this is roughly where I came from, right in that area where that sign is. It doesn't seem like a far walk, but boy, it is. And this is where the barn was, where those trees are there. And you can kind of see, if I zoom in a little bit, that plaque over there is roughly where the barn stood. Zoom out a little bit. But yeah, as you see here, this is the tree. Well, actually, the child of the tree that Hugh Mercer leaned on and sat against. And there's been efforts now to continue on with this tree and preserving it. And you see the little acorns. That's so cool. Because this is called the Mercer Oak. As you can see here, you can kind of see where the terrain slopes back up. And as I've said before on my channel, terrain is key with almost everything. And we're going to get right on the other side to show what the British perspective was. But as we walk here, you already see it changing a little bit. Now, walking this terrain, again, has given me a lot more insight to the soldiers fighting. I mean, it was difficult for me. I wasn't even running it. I'm not in shape. I'm not tired, but the Continentals were a band of, or I would say like a gaggle of poor-looking souls. There were times after the battle, even of Trenton, they were stealing the boots off of the dead soldiers because they didn't have any footwear. They looked poor. Because they were, you know. The Thank you. The battle was one of the least of their worries because, yeah, they fought to survive, but they also needed to win the battle and fight, and at the same time survive afterwards. It was cold, but we have now arrived at the Hessian and British side of the battle where they stood. So here are those famous pillars, and as you look around, this is not necessarily exactly where they fought, because archaeology digs have shown that rifle balls have made their way on across this part of the battle, which means this is where the British retreated. But they did fight coming along from here and down to there. This is on the other side of the road. That right here is the Mercer tree, and that's the line where the Continentals charged from, and that's the orchard line. And then those are the woods in the back there. The Clark farm's right over here. And they would come and they would storm across here and fight. And Mercer somehow, somewhere along here, he'll be bayoneted, and then he'll be brought along here to the Mercer tree to be sat and rest while he not necessarily recovered from his wounds, but would at least be able to catch his breath, as one would say. And as you see, the train comes and slopes around this way, and it slopes down and into that groove here, this little ditch. And up there, this is about even ground from here to there. You can't really see it until you come over here. And this up here is a little bit higher, but the British were roughly here when they had their artillery and their cannons firing along into here. That's about how the battle came. It came from this northwesterly direction to the southeast, if I'm correct. And all along here is where a lot of archaeological digs and excavations have happened, finding those rifle balls, showing that sharpshooters were able to try to pick off anybody retreating. Now, from what I remember, the Mercer oak, its age is unknown because it was hit by lightning at so many times. But there are some accounts of the owner, Clark, talking about the tree before the battle. But the age is still unknown. But I want to talk again more about its age because maybe you guys had questions. And that's the only answer I could give about how old the tree was. The tree had to be brought down right at 2000, somewhere in the 2000s. So it wasn't that long ago, but the tree here that you see behind me, that tree was that tree's been there since the 80s. And then there's other trees that are to be saved and grown, from what I heard. And they're raising multi-generational trees to keep that legacy on. And that's great. That's honestly great. So yeah, I just wanted to I'll touch upon that. Now, after Princeton, Washington would later find out, while he is in Morristown Morriston, not MoorestowN. So that's where I'm from. He would have to find out one of the hard ways of where the British were going to go next. And we will famously see Clinton will go down into the Chesapeake eventually and come up through there, through Maryland and Pennsylvania, to try to capture Philadelphia, while Burgoyne comes south from Canada for the Saratoga campaign. So the army's a bit divided. And what happens is that we have simultaneously almost the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Paoli, and Washington's encampment at Valley Forge. Meanwhile, almost during the same time, the Saratoga campaign's happening, with the British trying to control the Hudson Valley corridor and Lake Champlain to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies and kind of like cut the head off the snake. Washington won't have much luck at Brandywine. He will still save his army, and that's usually the goal, is saving the army, preserving the army. But there, you'll have von Steuben turn this ragtag team of American Continentals into a full-blown professional army. But Princeton here, well, also Horatio Gates and the traitorous Benedict Arnold will also win at Saratoga and force Burgoyne to surrender. But it's at Princeton, where I walk, where the American revolutionary dream of becoming independent is ignited and adds fuel to that fire of patriotism which our founding fathers signed for the Declaration of Independence. Gave more meaning to the word freedom. It gave more meaning of what it was to become an American. It gave more meaning to what liberty costs and freedom. And that turning point happened at the end of the 10 crucial days at the Battle of Princeton. Now, I gotta add that I did have a few ancestors who fought here at Princeton. One was a Philadelphia associator. His name escapes me. But I had an ancestor who fought with Colonel Moses Hazen Regiment. And he'd be at all the battles here at Princeton, Trenton, and it fills me with great pride to know that he did serve and fight, regardless of what he did. And it makes me proud to know that I know somebody who did. Well, I'm related to. I didn't know him. His name was Joseph Cloud on my great-grandfather's side, who is also on my mother's side, her mother's father, his side. So I wanted to let you guys know that Princeton has a familial tie for me. Now, where I stand here, thanks to this interpretive sign, we are here. Clark House is behind me, battlefield map, the colonnade, Mercer Oak, the parking, all along here. We stand where Mulder's battery held the line in the famous painting here. So Captain Mulder says, and his crew of 20 boys recruited from Philadelphia's dock area strategically positioned their artillery on a small hill near the Clark House. Due to this advantageous position, British soldiers couldn't get a clear shot at motor boys who tirelessly fired grape shot into the enemy ranks. Their incredible effort kept the British pinned down behind fences 200 yards from this spot. The battery didn't let up until General George Washington arrived with reinforcements. And after the battle, Moulter's crew served as a rearguard to delay the British soldiers arriving from Trenton. And out of a sense of pride, Moulter and his boys defied orders to spike and abandoned the guns after the battle. Instead, aided by 40 men per cannon, they ran them after the army and on to the safety of Morristown, an action for which Moulter was nearly court-martialed. So, in the early stages of the battle, the disciplined British soldiers forced the Americans into a chaotic retreat. As Brigadier General Hugh Mercer's and Colonel John Cadwallader's forces regrouped beyond the Thomas Clark House, they were protected by two 4-pounder cannons commanded by Captain Joseph Moulter of Philadelphia. Moulter's battery prevented the British from advancing, giving the Americans time to organize a counterattack. Honestly, 20 boys recruited from Philadelphia's dock area to hold this ground from the British, that takes a lot of guts. And Captain Moulter probably should not have been court-martialed just because of that. I mean, it was different orders, whatnot. But, I mean, that is remarkable. Talk about heroism in the face of almost near defeat. That is something that should never be forgotten. And it isn't going to be forgotten because of this marker here. So, I wanted to add that in too. I would also like to take a moment for the book today given to me by the Second Time Books in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, for letting me use Rick Atkinson, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777, and allowing me to bring this book with me for the source material for this video. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.